A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. The Price of Shame. The stench of unwashed bodies and desperation hung thick in the village square as Isadora pressed herself against the wooden post, her wrists raw from the coarse rope binding them. The autumn morning had dawned gray and cheerless, matching the mood of the gathered crowd. Her blonde hair, once her mother's pride, now hung in tangled strands around her face, dulled by days of confinement and the weight of impending doom. The crowd gathered like vultures, their voices a cacophony of whispers and jeers that cut deeper than any blade. Women she'd known since childhood averted their eyes, while men who'd once shown kindness now regarded her with the cold indifference reserved for livestock. "I offer my daughter as tribute to His Majesty." Her father's voice boomed across the collection square, his weathered face displaying not an ounce of the love she'd once believed existed there. "She may be barren and useless for breeding, but she's got strong hands for labor and knows her way around herbs." Garrett stood tall despite his 50 years, his graying beard unable to hide the bitter lines that had formed around his mouth since her mother's death. Issa lifted her chin despite the humiliation burning through her veins like liquid fire. At 22, she'd endured years of failed transformations, monthly disappointments when her body refused to shift under the full moon's call, and the crushing weight of knowing she'd never bear children. The village healer had confirmed it when she'd reached maturity. Something was broken inside her, some essential piece missing that would forever mark her as defective. But this, being sold like livestock while her neighbors watched, this was a new depth of degradation that threatened to shatter what remained of her spirit. "Father, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the market's din. "Don't do this. I can work harder, eat less. I won't be a burden anymore." Garrett turned away as if she were already dead to him, his jaw set in the stubborn line she remembered from her childhood. "The decision is made, girl. Should have thought of your worth before disappointing the pack for the 100th time." The memories crashed over her like winter waves against the rocky coastline. Her mother, Meredith, dying in a pool of blood after trying desperately to give birth to the son Garrett craved. The midwife shaking her head grimly, explaining in hushed tones that some women simply couldn't carry shifter children to term. The genetic incompatibility, the body rejecting what it couldn't support, all clinical terms that couldn't diminish the raw agony of loss. Issa had been barely 14 then, old enough to understand that her mother's death had been deemed a necessary sacrifice for the pack's bloodline, but too young to comprehend the full weight of what that meant for her own future. "The harvest failed again this season," announced Elder Thorne from his position near the tribute collection area. His gray eyes swept over the assembled offerings, sacks of grain, silver coins, and now, human flesh. "King Caspian's collectors are here to evaluate our tribute. It must be deemed sufficient." Issa's blood turned to ice at the mention of the Alpha King's name. She'd heard the stories whispered in dark corners and around dying fires, tales of what happened to tributes sent to the capital, servants who disappeared into the depths of the royal castle, never to be seen again, warriors conscripted into endless battles against neighboring kingdoms, women used for purposes she didn't dare imagine, their screams echoing through stone corridors until they fell silent forever. A commotion near the village entrance drew everyone's attention, the crowd turning as one toward the thundering sound of approaching horses. The royal collectors had arrived early, their mounts' hooves striking the cobblestones with military precision. 3 men dismounted in perfect synchronization, their black cloaks bearing the silver wolf emblem of the crown. A stylized beast with eyes that seemed to follow the viewer, mouth open in an eternal howl of dominance. The lead collector, a scarred man named Vex, whose reputation preceded him like a dark cloud, surveyed the tribute with cold calculation. Half his face bore the marks of claws, some said from the king himself during a moment of displeasure, and his remaining eye held the flat, emotionless stare of a man who'd seen too much death to be moved by it anymore. "This year's offering appears adequate," Vex declared, his voice carrying the authority of the crown and the implied threat of royal displeasure should adequacy prove insufficient. His gaze lingered on the grain sacks, mentally calculating their worth, before moving to the bound prisoners with the practiced eye of a slave trader. When his attention fell on Issa, Something shifted in his expression. Interest, perhaps, or merely the recognition of something unexpected. "This one," he said, approaching with measured steps. "She's healthy?" "Healthy as a horse," Garrett replied quickly, his eagerness to be rid of his daughter evident in every word. He refused to meet Isa's gaze, focusing instead on the silver coins that would help him through the coming winter. Strong back, good with herbs and healing. Her mother was skilled in such arts before. Vex approached, circling Isa like a predator evaluating prey, his boots crunching against the scattered straw beneath their feet. "Wolfless?" The question was delivered with clinical detachment, as if her greatest shame were merely another item to catalog. "Aye, but she works harder than most, blessed with the gift." Garrett lied smoothly, the words rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "And Barren?" Vex pressed, his single eye studying Isa's face for any reaction. The word hit Isa like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and setting her cheeks ablaze with humiliation. Around the square, she could feel the weight of dozens of stares, some pitying, others contemptuous. "That remains to be seen," her father hedged, though they both knew the truth. 5 years of maturity with no sign of fertility, no monthly cycles that might herald the possibility of children. Her condition was as clear as the sunrise. Vex nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the assessment. The king has use for such women. They cause fewer complications in the castle hierarchy. No jealous mates to appease, no bloodline disputes to settle. His scarred lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a more human face. "Yes, she'll do nicely." Before Isa could process the full implications of his words, rough hands seized her arms and shoved her toward the tribute cart. She found herself alongside an elderly man who'd stolen grain and a young boy whose family couldn't afford the tax. The wheels creaked as they began moving, carrying her away from everything she'd ever known. The journey to the capital took 3 days through increasingly treacherous terrain. Isa's companions spoke in hushed tones about the Alpha King, sharing stories that grew more terrifying with each telling. They said he was unnaturally tall, that his eyes could paralyze lesser wolves with a single glance, that he'd killed his own father to claim the throne. "I heard he's searching for a mate," whispered the grain thief, an old man named Henrik. "But every woman presented to him has been found wanting. Some say he devours them when they displease him." The boy, barely 16, shivered despite the warm afternoon. "My cousin served in the castle kitchens, said the king walks the halls at night, and you can hear his wolf howling from miles away. Grief and rage, she called it. Like he's lost something precious and can't get it back." Isa listened but said nothing. What could she possibly offer such a creature? She who couldn't shift, couldn't bear children, couldn't even inspire love in her own father. Whatever fate awaited her in the capital, it couldn't be worse than the slow death she'd been living in the village. As the sun set on their second day of travel, the massive walls of Valdris came into view. The capital rose from the landscape like a dark crown, its towers piercing the sky with an arrogance that spoke of absolute power. The castle itself seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its black stone walls giving it an ominous presence that made Isa's skin crawl. The guards at the gate barely glanced at their tribute cart before waving them through. Inside the city walls, the streets bustled with activity despite the late hour. Merchants hawked their wares. Taverns spilled golden light and raucous laughter onto the cobblestones. And everywhere she looked, Isa saw evidence of the pack hierarchy that ruled this realm. Wolves in human form moved with predatory grace, their enhanced senses and strength evident in every gesture. They instinctively gave way to stronger alphas, formed protective clusters around their mates, and maintained the careful dance of dominance and submission that kept their society functioning. And somewhere in that towering castle ahead, the Alpha King waited. Chapter 2: Eyes of Steel. The castle's great hall stretched before them like the maw of some ancient beast, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to move and writhe in the flickering torchlight. Massive stone pillars carved with wolves in various stages of transformation supported the weight of centuries, while banners bearing the royal crest hung motionless in the stagnant air. Isa stumbled forward with the other tributes, her legs weak from days of confinement in the cart. The guards flanked them on either side, their hands resting casually on sword hilts as they guided the procession toward the raised dais at the hall's far end. Each footstep echoed like thunder in the oppressive silence, announcing their arrival to whatever horrors awaited. The throne itself was a masterwork of intimidation. Carved from a single block of obsidian, its surface polished to mirror brightness. Wolf heads formed the armrests, their mouths open in eternal snarls, while the high back bore intricate engravings that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. But it was the figure seated upon that throne that made Issa's breath catch in her throat. King Caspian Ironhold was everything the stories had claimed, and more. His imposing height was evident even while seated, his broad shoulders filling the throne's width with an authority that needed no crown to announce itself. Dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, framing a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cold calculation that lived in every line. His full beard was perfectly groomed, giving him the appearance of a warrior king who'd stepped from the pages of ancient legends. But it was his clothing that truly marked him as something beyond mortal comprehension. The dark leather tunic hugged his powerful frame like a second skin, while matching pants disappeared into boots that had clearly seen battle. Over it all, he wore a magnificent cloak that pooled around the throne like spilled blood, the dark reddish-brown fabric rich and luxurious, its fur collar speaking of creatures that had died to adorn their king. "Your Majesty," Vex announced, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "This year's tribute from the outer provinces." Caspian's gaze swept over the assembled offerings, with the detached interest of a man examining livestock. His eyes, a startling shade of golden amber that seemed to glow in the torchlight, lingered briefly on Henrik, dismissed the boy entirely, then settled on Issa with an intensity that made her skin burn. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath their feet. Henrik and the boy immediately complied, their knees hitting the floor as they prostrated themselves before the throne. Issa took a single step forward but remained standing, her chin raised in unconscious defiance. The hall fell deadly silent, the only sound her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "You do not kneel," Caspian observed, rising from his throne with fluid grace. As he stood, his true height became apparent. He towered over everyone present, his presence filling the space around him like a physical force. Interesting. He descended the dais steps with predatory slowness, each movement calculated to display the lethal power contained within his frame. The other tributes pressed themselves lower against the floor, as if trying to disappear entirely. But Issa found herself rooted in place by those burning amber eyes. "What is your name?" he asked, circling her just as Vex had done in the village square, though this inspection carried infinitely more danger. "Isadora," she replied, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "But most call me Issa." "Most," he repeated, amusement flickering across his features. "And what should I call you?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Issa felt the weight of every gaze in the hall, the barely contained hostility of the court nobles who ringed the chamber, the nervous energy of the guards who'd likely never seen anyone remain standing in their king's presence. "Whatever pleases your Majesty," she answered finally, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Caspian laughed, a sound devoid of warmth that echoed off the stone walls like breaking glass. "How diplomatic. Tell me, Isadora, who prefers Issa, why do you not show proper respect to your king?" The honest answer would have been that she had nothing left to lose, that a life of humiliation and rejection had burned away her capacity for submission. Instead, she met his gaze directly, something that made several courtiers gasp audibly, and spoke the truth that lived in her heart. "Respect is earned, your Majesty, not demanded." The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Caspian went very still, his amber eyes beginning to shift and change, taking on the predatory gleam of his wolf. When he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable undertone of an alpha's command, the supernatural compulsion that could force submission from any shifter. "Kneel," he ordered, the word layered with power that pressed against Issa's mind like a physical weight. She felt it then, the crushing force of his will, the absolute authority that had cowed nations and brought enemies to their knees. It crashed over her in waves, seeking to overwhelm her consciousness and force her body into compliance. Around her, she could hear the other tributes whimpering, their bodies trembling under the spillover effects of power not even directed at them. But something within Issa pushed back. Some deep, instinctive part of her that had never learned to yield, that recognized the Alpha's command as the cage it truly was. The pressure built behind her eyes until she thought her skull might crack. But still she remained standing, her blue eyes locked with his golden ones in a battle of wills that should have been impossible. Seconds stretched into eternity as king and peasant stared at each other across a chasm of power and privilege. Somewhere in the watching crowd, she heard a woman's sharp intake of breath, the whispered prayers of men who thought they were witnessing an execution. Finally, impossibly, the pressure lifted. Caspian stepped back, his expression shifting from commanding fury to something far more dangerous. Curiosity. "Well," he murmured, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "That's unexpected." The transformation began subtly, starting with his eyes. The amber irises darkened to molten gold, then began to shift and swirl as his wolf pressed closer to the surface. His canine teeth elongated into fangs that gleamed white in the torchlight, while his fingers curved into claws that could rend flesh from bone with casual ease. The aura of power that surrounded him intensified, until the very air seemed to vibrate with barely contained violence. This was no mere display of authority. This was the Alpha King showing just how easily he could destroy anyone who defied him. Several courtiers stumbled backward, unable to withstand the supernatural pressure even as bystanders. Yet Issa remained unmoved, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Her heart hammered against her ribs and sweat beaded on her forehead, but her feet stayed planted firmly on the cold stone floor. Something in her recognized that running would mean death, that her only chance of survival lay in meeting his challenge head-on. "You resist my command," Caspian said, his voice now carrying the harmonic growl of his wolf. "Few have such fortitude." From the corner of her eye, Issa noticed several of the court nobles exchanging meaningful glances. A woman in silk robes leaned toward a man whose fingers bore the heavy rings of nobility, whispering something that made his eyes widen with surprise. Whatever they were seeing in this exchange, it clearly held significance beyond a simple display of defiance. "I resist what seeks to break me," Issa replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "I've been broken enough for one lifetime." Something flickered across Caspian's partially transformed features. Was it recognition? Understanding? Before she could analyze it further, he was speaking again, his voice returning to its human timbre though his eyes remained wolf-bright. "During your journey here, what did your companions tell you about me?" The question seemed innocuous enough, but Issa sensed the trap within it. "They said many things, Your Majesty, most of them probably tales grown larger with each telling. Summarize." "That you're unnaturally tall," she said, gesturing slightly at his imposing frame. "That your gaze can paralyze lesser wolves. That you killed your father for the throne." "And do you believe these things?" Issa considered her words carefully. "I believe you're exactly as tall as they've said. I believe your presence affects others powerfully. I can feel it myself. As for patricide," she paused, studying his face for any telltale reaction. "I believe a man becomes king through whatever means necessary, and history is written by the victors." For the first time since entering the hall, Caspian smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. The wolf retreated from his features, fangs shortening back to human teeth, claws retracting to reveal long, elegant fingers. When he spoke, his voice held a note of something that might have been approval. Wisdom disguised as diplomacy. How refreshing. He returned to his throne with the same fluid grace he'd displayed while descending, the great cloak settling around him like wings. "Tell me, Isadora, what skills do you possess that might make you useful in my court?" The question caught her off guard. Useful? She'd spent her entire life being told she was the opposite. I know something of herbs and healing, Your Majesty. My mother taught me before she died. Healing," he repeated thoughtfully. "And what else? I can read and write. I manage household accounts reasonably well. She faltered, unsure how to quantify a lifetime of making herself indispensable through sheer determination. "You survive," Caspian finished for her, his golden eyes studying her with renewed interest. Despite being born into a world that has no place for you, you endure. That is a skill rarer than you might imagine. Chapter 3. Shadows and Secrets. The servants' quarters assigned to Issa were more luxurious than any room she'd ever inhabited, yet they felt like a gilded cage. Stone walls were softened by rich tapestries depicting hunting scenes, while a narrow window offered a view of the castle's inner courtyard. The bed, though small, boasted actual feathers rather than straw, and a wash basin with clean water awaited her use, luxuries beyond her previous comprehension. 3 days had passed since her confrontation with King Caspian in the Great Hall, and she'd been assigned the peculiar role of personal attendant to the Alpha King himself. The other servants whispered about it in corners, their voices carrying equal measures of envy and terror. No one could remember the last time His Majesty had taken such direct interest in a tribute, and the speculation ran wild through the castle's corridors. Each morning, Issa was summoned to attend the king's chambers, bringing him his first meal of the day and ensuring his quarters remained immaculate. The work itself was simple enough, but the man she served remained an enigma wrapped in contradictions. This particular morning found her entering the royal chambers just as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. The king's apartments were a study in controlled power, dark furniture carved from imported woods, weapons displayed with ceremonial precision, and books that spoke of a mind far more complex than his reputation suggested. Caspian stood at the great window overlooking his kingdom, still wearing the leather pants from the night before, but bare from the waist up. Issa tried not to stare at the map of scars that decorated his back, evidence of battles fought and wars won. Each mark told a story of violence survived, of strength tested and proven. "Your Majesty," she announced quietly, setting the breakfast tray on the table beside his bed. "The kitchen staff prepared your usual fare." He turned slowly, and she was struck anew by the contained power in his every movement. In the morning light, his amber eyes appeared almost human, though she'd learned to watch for the telltale shifts that announced his wolf's proximity to the surface. "Join me," he said, gesturing toward the chairs arranged near the fireplace. "Your Majesty, I couldn't—" It wasn't a request. Issa perched carefully on the edge of the indicated chair, her hands folded in her lap as she watched him settle into the seat across from her. This had become their routine over the past 3 days. These strange, intimate conversations that occurred in the gray hours between night and full dawn. "Tell me about your dreams," Caspian said, his voice carrying none of the royal command she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, it held an almost gentle curiosity that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "My dreams, Your Majesty? You cry out in your sleep. The guards report hearing you through the walls." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. "They seem intense." Heat flooded Issa's cheeks at the realization that her private torments had become public knowledge. The dreams had been coming every night since her arrival, vivid, unsettling visions that left her gasping and disoriented. "I see a silver moon," she began hesitantly. "But it's not like any moon I've ever witnessed. It seems to pulse with its own light, and there are voices." She trailed off, afraid he'd think her mad. "What do the voices say?" "I can't understand the words, but they feel ancient, important. Like they're trying to tell me something crucial that I'm too foolish to comprehend." She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "They speak of walking between worlds, of power that predates the pacts themselves." Something flickered across Caspian's features. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. "Have you always had such dreams?" "No, Your Majesty. They began the night I arrived here." She hesitated, then decided honesty was her best course. "There's something about this place, about the stones themselves. Sometimes when I'm cleaning your chambers, I feel as though the walls are watching me. Show me," he said suddenly, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Your Majesty, these stones that watch you, show me which ones." Confused but obedient, Issa stood and moved toward the wall near his bed. As her fingertips traced the ancient stones, she felt it again, that strange pulse of recognition, as if the castle itself was responding to her presence. "Here," she whispered, her palm flattening against a particular block. And here, Caspian moved to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. When he placed his hand over hers against the stone, she gasped at the sudden intensity of the sensation. The cold rock seemed to warm beneath their joined touch, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw symbols flickering just beneath the surface. Ancient markings that spoke of power and purpose. "What do you see?" he asked quietly, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "Symbols," she breathed, afraid to speak louder lest she break whatever spell had settled over them. Like writing, but not in any language I recognize. They're beautiful and terrible at the same time." Caspian's hand tightened over hers for just a moment, before he stepped back, leaving her feeling strangely bereft. "The castle is old," he said carefully. "Older than the current dynasty, older than the pack system itself. Some say it was built by those who came before. Who came before? But he'd already moved away, reaching for a shirt from the wardrobe as if their intimate moment had never occurred. "Finish your duties here, then attend me in the map room. We have much to discuss regarding the kingdom's affairs." The dismissal stung, but Issa had learned to recognize when the king retreated behind his walls of authority. She completed her tasks efficiently, making his bed with military precision and ensuring every surface gleamed. But as she worked, her mind kept returning to the warmth of his hand over hers, the way her body had responded to his proximity with a hunger she didn't dare name. It was while replacing the water in his wash basin that she first noticed them, shadows that moved independently of any light source, flickering at the edges of her vision like living things. When she turned to look directly, they disappeared, but she could feel their presence like a weight against her consciousness. The map room proved to be another revelation of the king's complexity. Charts and documents covered every available surface, detailing trade routes, military positions, and diplomatic correspondence that painted a picture of a ruler far more engaged with governing than the stories suggested. Caspian stood bent over a particularly detailed map of the northern territories, his finger tracing what appeared to be supply lines. "The harvest failures aren't isolated to your village," he said, without looking up as she entered. 7 provinces have reported similar problems. The soil itself seems to be failing, as if something is draining the life from it. Issa approached cautiously, studying the marks and notations that covered the map. "Have you considered blight, Your Majesty? My mother taught me that certain diseases can spread through root systems underground. It's not blight." His voice carried a grim certainty that made her look up sharply. "I've had the court's best scholars examine the affected areas. This is something else entirely. Something unnatural." Before she could respond, a commotion in the corridor outside drew their attention. Raised voices, the sound of running feet, and underneath it all, a low growling that made the hair on Issa's arms stand on end. Caspian was moving before she could blink, his body flowing into a partial transformation as his senses expanded to their supernatural limits. His eyes shifted to brilliant gold, while his canine teeth elongated, and she caught the scent of power rolling off him in waves, wild and dangerous and utterly compelling. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones of his wolf. But as he reached for the door, another sound stopped him cold, a howl that seemed to come from within the very walls of the castle, echoing through stone and mortar, with a loneliness that made Issa's heart clench. "What was that?" she whispered. Caspian's expression darkened, his partially transformed features settling into grim lines. "A reminder," he said softly, "that some wounds never fully heal." The howl came again, closer this time, and with it came the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the castle's corridors. But instead of fear, Issa felt an odd sense of recognition, as if that mournful cry was answering something deep within her own chest. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "I don't think whatever's out there means harm. It sounds—" She struggled for the right word. "Lost." Caspian studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes searching her face for something she couldn't name. "You have unusual instincts for someone without the gift," he observed. "Most humans would be terrified by that sound. Most humans haven't spent their lives listening to the pain others try to hide," she replied without thinking, then flushed at her boldness. Something shifted in his expression, a softening she'd glimpsed only rarely in their morning conversations. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose they haven't." The howling faded gradually, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken truths. Caspian remained partially transformed, his enhanced senses apparently still tracking whatever had been moving through his castle, while Issa found herself studying the play of late afternoon light across his altered features. "Tell me about your mother," he said suddenly, his voice still carrying traces of his wolf's influence, beyond her knowledge of herbs. What was she like? The unexpected question caught Issa off guard, stirring memories she usually kept carefully buried. "She was kind," she began slowly, "even when she was dying. Even when she knew the baby she carried would likely kill her, she never stopped trying to comfort others. The village women would come to her with their troubles, and she'd listen for hours, offering what help she could. And your father," Issa's expression hardened. "My father loved the idea of her more than the reality. He wanted a wife who would bear him strong sons, who would enhance his standing in the pack. When she couldn't give him that," she shrugged, the gesture encompassing years of disappointment and resentment. "He sold you to the first opportunity that presented itself." "Yes." Caspian moved closer, his golden eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Do you hate him for it?" The honest answer surprised her. "No," she said after a moment's consideration. "I pity him. He threw away the only family he had left for the chance at 20 silver coins. In the end, he'll die alone, and I'll still be here." "Here," Caspian repeated, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "In my castle. In my service." "Yes, Your Majesty." "And how does that make you feel?" It was a dangerous question, one that invited honesty she wasn't sure she could afford. But something in his expression, in the way the afternoon light caught the gold flecks in his eyes, made her want to tell him the truth. "Terrified," she admitted, "and grateful, and confused by things I don't understand." Chapter 4. Forbidden Desires. The weeks that followed brought an unsettling rhythm to Issa's existence within the castle walls. Her days were structured around Caspian's needs, attending him at dawn, managing his correspondence, and ensuring his chambers remained pristine. But it was the stolen moments between duty and rest that left her breathless with anticipation and terror in equal measure. Tonight was different. The castle buzzed with nervous energy as preparations for the harvest moon celebration reached their crescendo. Noble families from across the kingdom had arrived to pay their respects to the Alpha King, their carriages clogging the courtyard as servants scurried to accommodate the influx of guests. Issa stood before the small mirror in her quarters, adjusting the simple blue dress that had been provided for the evening's festivities. The fabric was finer than anything she'd owned before, but it felt like a costume, a pretense that she belonged among these people who could scent her inadequacy from across a room. A sharp knock interrupted her brooding. "Enter," she called, expecting one of the kitchen maids with instructions for the evening. Instead, Marcus, captain of the royal guard, filled her doorway, his scarred face set in disapproving lines. The man had never liked her presence in the castle, viewing her as a potential threat to the king's security. His distrust radiated from every pore as he delivered his message. "His Majesty requests your presence in the Great Hall," Marcus said curtly. "You're to assist with serving the noble guests." "Of course, Captain." Issa kept her voice neutral, though she could read the subtext clearly enough. The other servants would handle the actual work. She was being displayed, shown off like a curious pet for the amusement of the court. The Great Hall had been transformed for the celebration. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, while garlands of autumn flowers draped every available surface. Long tables groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes, and the air hummed with conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter. Issa made her way through the crowd, carrying a pitcher of wine and trying to remain invisible. But invisibility was impossible when every conversation seemed to center around her unusual position in the castle hierarchy. "I heard she resisted the Alpha Command," whispered Lady Catherine, a sharp-faced woman whose husband controlled the eastern territories. Simply stood there while His Majesty's power washed over her like water. "Impossible," scoffed Lord William, though his eyes followed Issa's movement with calculating interest. No mere human could withstand that level of compulsion. Then perhaps she's not as human as she appears, Lady Catherine replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There are bloodlines that carry unusual gifts. From his position at the head table, Caspian watched the exchange with hooded eyes. He wore formal court attire tonight, a midnight blue doublet that emphasized his broad shoulders, paired with black leather pants that molded to his powerful frame. The great cloak was absent, replaced by a circlet of silver that caught the candlelight and marked him unmistakably as royalty. But it was the tension radiating from his form that made Issa's skin prickle with awareness. Every line of his body spoke of barely controlled power, of a predator forced to play diplomat when his nature demanded more direct action. Issa, his voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade, drawing every eye in the hall to her position near the wine table. Attend me. The walk to his side felt endless, each step monitored by dozens of hostile gazes. When she reached him, Caspian stood and offered his arm in a gesture that sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility. Kings did not escort servants. Ever. Your Majesty, she murmured, accepting his arm with fingers that trembled slightly. Is something amiss? Walk with me, he said simply, leading her toward the gardens that adjoined the hall. Behind them, Issa could hear the whispered explosion of gossip that their departure would generate. But Caspian seemed utterly unconcerned with propriety. The gardens were a revelation in the moonlight, carefully cultivated paths winding between beds of night-blooming flowers whose fragrance filled the cool air with intoxicating sweetness. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes before Caspian spoke. You're uncomfortable with the attention. It wasn't a question. But Issa nodded anyway. I'm not accustomed to being observed so closely, Your Majesty. In my village, I was invisible by choice and circumstance. And here you're anything but invisible. He stopped beside a marble fountain, its gentle splash providing a counterpoint to their conversation. Tell me, what do you make of tonight's gathering? Issa considered her words carefully. The nobles are nervous, Your Majesty. Beneath the celebration, there's an undercurrent of fear. They're watching you as much as they're watching me, waiting for something. Waiting for me to choose a mate, Caspian said bluntly, his golden eyes reflecting the moon's light like twin flames. The pressure has been building for months. My advisors believe a royal wedding would stabilize the kingdom, provide hope for the future. The words hit Issa like a physical blow, though she tried to hide her reaction. And what do you believe, Your Majesty? Caspian moved closer. Close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could catch his scent. Pine and leather, and something uniquely masculine that made her pulse quicken. I believe, he said softly, that power shared is power halved. A mate would be a weakness my enemies could exploit, unless she were strong enough to be an asset rather than a liability. The words escaped before Issa could stop them, and she immediately regretted her boldness. But Caspian's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. Strong enough, he repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that would be the key, wouldn't it? His hand moved to cup her cheek, the touch sending electricity racing through her nervous system. What makes you strong, Issa? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning she didn't dare examine too closely. I survive, Your Majesty. No matter what life throws at me, I endure, even when it would be easier to break. Especially then. Something shifted in his expression, the careful control he maintained slipping just enough to reveal the hunger underneath. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with devastating gentleness, and Issa found herself leaning into the touch, despite every rational thought screaming warnings. You're playing a dangerous game, he murmured, his voice dropping to the rough timbre she'd learned to associate with his wolf's influence. Being alone with me like this, letting me touch you. I know. The admission was barely a whisper. Do you? His other hand came up to frame her face, tilting it toward the moonlight. Do you understand what you do to me? How your presence affects my control? Before she could answer, voices from the hall interrupted the charged moment. Loud, drunken laughter followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Caspian's head snapped toward the noise, his enhanced hearing picking up details that escaped her human senses. What is it? Issa asked, though part of her was grateful for the interruption. Another moment in his arms, and she might have done something irrevocably foolish. Lord Aldrich by the sound of it. 3 sheets to the wind and looking for trouble. Caspian's jaw tightened with barely controlled irritation. I should return before he causes an incident that requires bloodshed to resolve. But as they turned toward the hall, Aldrich himself stumbled into the garden, his expensive doublet stained with wine, and his eyes bright with malicious intoxication. The man was young, perhaps 25, with the soft features of nobility, and the cruel smile of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Your Majesty," Aldrich slurred, executing a mocking bow that nearly sent him tumbling into the fountain. "And your pet. How delightfully domestic." Isa felt Caspian go very still beside her, the kind of supernatural stillness that preceded explosive violence. When she glanced up at his face, she saw his eyes beginning to shift toward gold, his wolf responding to the perceived threat. "Lord Aldrich," Caspian said, his voice carrying deadly calm, "perhaps you should return to your chambers and sleep off the evening's indulgences." "Perhaps," Aldrich agreed with drunken amiability, "but first I'd like a closer look at the creature that's captured our king's attention." He lurched forward, his wine-soaked breath washing over Isa as he leered down at her. "What's so special about you, Wolfless? What tricks do you use to warm the royal bed?" The insult hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Isa felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. But before she could respond, Caspian moved with inhuman speed. His hand closed around Aldrich's throat, lifting the smaller man off his feet with casual ease. "Apologize," Caspian growled, his voice now fully transformed by his wolf's influence. "Now." But Aldrich, emboldened by drink and stupidity, only laughed. "For speaking truth, everyone knows what she is, Majesty. A barren, wolfless whore who—" The words cut off in a strangled gasp as Caspian's grip tightened. For a moment, murder lived in the king's golden eyes, and Isa was certain she was about to witness an execution. "Stop," she said quietly, her hand touching Caspian's arm. "Please. He's drunk and foolish, but killing him won't change what people think." The contact seemed to break through Caspian's rage. His eyes met hers, and she saw the exact moment he wrestled his wolf back under control. With visible effort, he released Aldrich, who collapsed gasping to the garden path. "You have 10 seconds to remove yourself from my sight," Caspian said softly, his voice carrying the promise of terrible consequences should the warning go unheeded. "If I see you again tonight, drunk or sober, you'll learn exactly why men call me the Iron King." Aldrich scrambled away without another word, leaving Isa and Caspian alone in the moonlit garden once more. But the moment's magic was shattered, replaced by harsh reality and the knowledge that their unusual relationship was providing ammunition for the king's enemies. "I should go," Isa said quietly, though every instinct urged her to stay, to comfort the man whose control had nearly shattered for her sake. "Yes," Caspian agreed, his voice raw with suppressed emotion. "You should," but neither of them moved. Instead, they stood frozen in the moonlight, 2 souls drawn together by forces neither fully understood, while the weight of impossibility pressed down upon them like a stone. Chapter 5. Shattered Trust. The dawn following the harvest moon celebration brought an ominous stillness to the castle, as if the very stones held their breath in anticipation of coming storms. Isa moved through her morning duties with mechanical precision, her mind still reeling from the events in the garden. The memory of Caspian's hands on her face, the way his eyes had burned with barely contained desire, haunted her every thought. But it was the look of murder that had crossed his features when Lord Aldrich insulted her that truly unsettled her. No one had ever defended her honor with such fierce protectiveness, and the knowledge that she could inspire such reactions in the Alpha King both thrilled and terrified her. She was arranging fresh flowers in the royal chambers when Councillor Matthias entered without announcement, his wizened face grave with purpose. The elderly man had served the crown for decades, his loyalty beyond question, which made his presence all the more unsettling. "Miss Isadora," he said formally, his voice carrying none of the warmth he'd shown during their previous encounters. "His Majesty requires your immediate presence in the council chambers." Something in his tone made her stomach clench with dread. "Of course, Counselor. Is anything amiss?" Matthias's pale eyes studied her with uncomfortable intensity. That remains to be determined. Come. The walk through the castle's corridors felt like a funeral march. Servants they passed averted their gazes, and more than once Issa caught whispered conversations that died abruptly at her approach. Whatever was happening, news of it had already spread through the castle's vast network of gossip and speculation. The council chambers were a study in masculine authority, heavy oak furniture, weapons mounted on the walls, and tall windows that let in streams of gray morning light. But it was the collection of men gathered around the central table that made Issa's blood run cold. Caspian stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of royal composure that revealed nothing of the man who had nearly kissed her in the moonlight. Beside him sat Councillor Matthias, while across the table Lord Edmund, one of the kingdom's most influential nobles, waited with barely concealed satisfaction. But it was the documents spread across the table's surface that made Issa's knees weak. Parchment covered in official seals, maps marked with red ink, and what appeared to be architectural drawings of ritual sites. "Ah, Miss Isadora," Lord Edmund said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "How fortuitous that you could join us. We were just discussing some fascinating historical documents that have recently come to light." Caspian's golden eyes met hers briefly, and she saw something there. Regret, perhaps, or warning. But his expression remained carefully neutral as he gestured for her to approach the table. "These documents," Matthias began, his voice heavy with accusation, "detail ancient protocols for appeasing the old gods during times of famine and crop failure. Specifically, they outline the requirements for human sacrifice to restore the land's fertility." The words hit Issa like physical blows, each syllable driving the air from her lungs. "I don't understand, Counselor. What does this have to do with me?" Lord Edmund leaned forward, his thin lips curved in a predatory smile. "According to these texts, the most effective sacrifices are those who possess certain qualities. Women who are pure of body but barren of womb. Those who carry ancient bloodlines but lack the ability to pass them on. You're describing half the women in the kingdom," Issa said, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Are we?" Matthias pulled forth another document, this one bearing Caspian's royal seal. "This order, signed by His Majesty himself, specifically requests tributes matching those exact criteria. Written 3 months before your village's harvest failed. The betrayal crashed over her like a tidal wave, drowning her in its wake. 3 months before she'd been sold, before she'd resisted his command, before those stolen moments in gardens and private chambers. He had planned this from the beginning. Your Majesty," she whispered, her eyes searching his face for any sign of denial, any indication that this was some elaborate misunderstanding. But Caspian remained silent, his jaw set in granite lines that spoke of royal duty above personal desire. The man who had defended her honor less than 12 hours ago now stood unmoved as she was systematically destroyed. "The ritual sites have already been prepared," Lord Edmund continued with obvious relish. "The autumn moon provides the optimal timing for such ceremonies. His Majesty has been most thorough in his planning." "That's enough," Caspian said quietly, his first words since her arrival. But he still didn't deny the accusations, didn't offer the explanation she desperately needed to hear. Issa felt something breaking inside her chest. Not her heart, which had been broken too many times to matter, but something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or the naive belief that she might finally have found someone who valued her for more than her utility. "I see," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "And when is this ceremony to take place?" "The preparations will be complete within a fortnight," Matthias replied, though he had the grace to look uncomfortable with his role in the revelation. "A fortnight?" Issa nodded slowly, her mind already working despite the chaos of her emotions. "That should give your Majesty ample time to find a replacement should I prove inadequate for the purpose." The words were delivered with perfect courtesy, but she saw them hit their mark. Caspian's composure cracked just slightly, a muscle jumping in his jaw as her barb found its target. "Miss Isadora," Lord Edmund began, but she was already moving toward the door. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I have duties to attend to. Unless, of course, condemned women are excused from such mundane tasks." She didn't wait for permission to leave. sweeping from the chamber with what remained of her dignity intact. But once the heavy door closed behind her, the tears she'd held back came flooding forth. She stumbled toward the servants' quarters, her vision blurred and her chest tight with the effort of breathing. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before her, each step an agony of betrayal and loss. How could she have been so foolish? So naive as to believe that a king might care for a wolfless peasant girl beyond her usefulness to his political schemes. But even as her rational mind accepted the evidence, something deeper rebelled against it. The man who had touched her face with such tenderness, who had nearly lost control defending her honor, that couldn't have been an act. Could it? She reached her chambers and threw herself onto the narrow bed, burying her face in the pillow as sobs racked her body. Everything hurt. Her chest, her throat. The very core of her being felt hollowed out and raw. It was there, in the depths of her anguish, that the first whisper came. Child of two worlds, daughter of the moon. Issa sat up sharply, her tears forgotten as she scanned the empty room. The voice had been clear, distinct, but utterly impossible. She was alone. She could see every corner of the small chamber. You are more than they know, more than they can comprehend. This time the voice seemed to come from within the walls themselves, resonating through stone and mortar with an authority that made her skin prickle. As she watched in horrified fascination, shadows began to gather in the corners of the room, pooling like liquid darkness that moved with purpose. The blood remembers what the mind has forgotten. The shadows coalesced into forms, tall, ethereally beautiful beings whose features seemed to shift between human and something altogether more alien. Their eyes held depths that spoke of eons, while their skin possessed an otherworldly luminescence that made them appear carved from moonlight itself. "What are you?" Issa whispered, fear and fascination warring in her chest. "We are the Awoken," came the reply, though their lips didn't move. The words formed directly in her mind, carrying harmonics that bypassed her ears entirely. "And you, child, are the last of the Lunweavers, those who walked between worlds when the foundations of reality were still soft. That's impossible. I'm nobody. I'm wolfless, barren, useless." "Lies," the lead figure interrupted, its voice carrying absolute authority. The wolf touch diminished themselves when they forgot the old ways. "You carry the true power, the ability to weave reality itself according to your will." As if to demonstrate, one of the beings gestured toward the small window. The glass shimmered and changed, becoming transparent as water, then solid as steel, then fracturing into crystalline patterns that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. "Why are you telling me this?" Issa asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Because the tests begin now," they replied in unison. 3 trials to awaken what sleeps within you. 3 chances to claim your birthright or die in the attempt. Before she could respond, rough hands seized her from behind. Human hands, she realized with shock. Guards who had somehow entered her chambers without detection. She struggled briefly, but their grip was implacable, and something sharp pricked her neck. As consciousness faded, she heard Lord Edmund's voice as if from a great distance. His Majesty's sacrifice has served her purpose. Time to prepare her for the ritual. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Caspian himself, standing in her doorway with an expression of such anguish that it took her breath away. But whether his pain was for her fate or his own loss, she couldn't tell. And in that final moment before the drug took hold, she could have sworn she heard his wolf howling, a sound of grief and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. Chapter 6. A World Between Worlds. Consciousness returned slowly, like emerging from the depths of a dark ocean. Issa's first awareness was of cold, not the physical chill of stone floors, but something deeper that seemed to seep into her very soul. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a place that defied all logic and understanding. She stood in a vast space that wasn't quite a room, wasn't quite outdoors, where the sky above swirled with colors that had no names, and the ground beneath her feet felt solid, but appeared to be made of crystallized starlight. The air itself hummed with power, making her skin tingle with each breath. The Awoken surrounded her in a perfect circle, their ethereal forms more clearly defined here than they had been in her chambers. Up close, their beauty was indeed terrible. Features so perfect they bordered on inhuman, eyes that held the weight of eternity, and an aura of power that made her feel like an insect in comparison. "Welcome to the threshold, child of the moon," the lead figure spoke, its voice echoing strangely in this impossible space. "Here, between the world of flesh and the realm of pure thought, you will face what you truly are." "I don't understand," Issa said, her voice sounding small and lost. "What is this place?" "This is where Lunweavers are born," another of the beings replied, "where the trials that forge them into what they must become take place. Your bloodline has slept for generations, but the awakening can no longer be delayed." As if responding to their words, the space around them began to shift and change. The crystalline ground rippled like water, forming into new shapes and configurations, while the impossible sky darkened until only a silver moon provided illumination. But this moon was unlike anything Issa had ever seen. It pulsed with its own inner light, and as she stared at it, she could swear she heard voices calling from within its radiance. "The first trial," the lead awoken announced, "is truth. You must see reality as it truly is, without the comfortable lies that have shaped your existence." Before Issa could ask what that meant, the world exploded into visions. She saw herself as a child, attempting to shift under the full moon while her parents watched with growing desperation. But now she could see what they couldn't: threads of silver light that flowed around her, not the golden energy that marked true shifters, but something older, more primal. The vision shifted, showing her mother's death in vivid, horrible detail. But again, she saw more than she had as a terrified 14-year-old. Meredith hadn't died from the complications of childbirth alone. She had been fighting something, using power she barely understood to protect the daughter who would carry on a bloodline she didn't even know she possessed. She knew, one of the awoken whispered directly into her mind. In her final moments, she understood what you were destined to become. The child she carried would have been ordinary, a shifter like his father. But you were always meant for something greater. "No," Issa gasped, the truth too overwhelming to accept. "She died trying to give my father a son. She died because I wasn't enough. She died because she chose to pour her life force into awakening your dormant gifts, rather than saving herself." The bloodline demanded continuation, and she answered that call. The visions continued relentlessly. She saw every moment of rejection, every instance where her failure to shift had brought shame to her family. But now she could see the silver threads that had always surrounded her, the way reality seemed to bend slightly in response to her emotions, the small miracles that she'd always attributed to luck or coincidence, the grain that had survived the blight in the corner of their field where she'd prayed for help, the sick animals that had recovered after she'd tended them, the strange dreams that had always warned her of danger just in time to avoid it. "You were never broken," the awoken said gently. "You were simply awakening to a power so much greater than their small understanding that they couldn't recognize it." The first trial's visions faded, leaving Issa gasping and disoriented. But before she could process what she'd learned, the space around them shifted again, the crystalline ground rising into obstacles and barriers that stretched as far as the eye could see. "The second trial," another awoken announced, "is will. You must shape reality through desire alone, bending the fabric of existence to your intent." "I don't know how," Issa protested, staring at the impossible maze that had formed around them. "You have always known. Every time you wished for something desperately enough, reality conspired to provide it. Every time you needed strength, it came. The power has always been yours. You simply never recognized its source." Tentatively, Issa reached out toward one of the crystalline barriers. The moment her fingers made contact, she felt it, a flowing connection between her will and the substance of this strange realm. The barrier was solid, implacable, but she could sense its essential nature, the mathematical certainties that held it in place. "Change it," the awoken commanded. "Make it what you need it to be." Issa closed her eyes and imagined the barrier as water, fluid and yielding. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, she felt the crystalline structure beginning to soften under her touch. When she opened her eyes, her hand was passing through the barrier as if it were liquid light. "I did that," she whispered in amazement. You did that, they confirmed. Now do more. What followed was the most exhilarating and exhausting experience of Issa's life. She learned to reshape the crystalline maze with thought alone, to call light from darkness and solidity from air. The power flowed through her like molten silver, and with each success, she felt more of her true self awakening. But it was during the height of her success that disaster struck. In the real world, far beyond this dimensional threshold, Caspian had discovered the truth of her abduction. The howl of anguish that had echoed through the castle as he'd realized his role in her capture now reached across the dimensional barrier, calling to something deep within her soul. The sound shattered her concentration, and the maze collapsed around them in a cascade of breaking crystal. But worse than the physical destruction was the emotional devastation that followed. Even here, in this realm of infinite possibility, she couldn't escape the betrayal that had torn her heart to pieces. Focus, the Awoken commanded, but their voices seemed distant now, overwhelmed by the reality of what awaited her return. That was when they appeared, the guards who had captured her, somehow manifesting in this impossible space. But these weren't the same men who had dragged her from her chambers. These figures moved with inhuman coordination, their eyes empty of human consciousness, and Issa realized with growing horror that they were puppets, controlled by some outside force. The barrier weakens, one of the Awoken said urgently. Your pain calls to the physical realm, and now both worlds bleed together. The space around them began to fracture, reality becoming unstable as the boundaries between dimensions wavered. Through the cracks, Issa could see glimpses of the castle, of stone corridors and flickering torches. And moving through those corridors with desperate purpose, she saw Caspian. He looked haggard, his usually perfect composure shattered. His clothes were torn, his hands bloody from what appeared to be recent violence, and his eyes held the wild light of a man driven past his breaking point. When he spoke, his words somehow carried across the dimensional divide. "Where is she?" he roared, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones of his wolf. "What have you done with her?" The puppet guards in the threshold space moved to attack, but they were clumsy, their borrowed forms struggling to function in this realm of pure thought. Issa destroyed them with a gesture, her newfound power responding instinctively to the threat. But their destruction opened a wider rift between the worlds, and suddenly Caspian was there, not physically, but as a projection of will and desperate love that was strong enough to breach the dimensional barrier. Impossible, one of the Awoken breathed. No shifter should be able to, but Caspian was already moving toward Issa, his form solid despite being miles away in physical space. When their eyes met across the fractured reality, she saw everything: his genuine anguish at her perceived betrayal, his fury at being manipulated by his own counsel, and beneath it all, a love so fierce it had literally broken through the barriers between worlds. "The third trial begins," the lead Awoken announced, its voice heavy with portent. "You must choose, daughter of the moon. Will you claim the power to reshape reality itself, to rule over both worlds with absolute authority, or will you accept limitation, binding yourself to the heart of one man and the small scope of his mortal realm?" The choice materialized around them. On one side, infinite power stretching across dimensions, the ability to heal the world's wounds and remake civilization according to her will. On the other, Caspian's outstretched hand and the promise of a love that had proven strong enough to cross between worlds. "Choose quickly," another Awoken urged. "The barriers fail, and soon this moment will be lost forever." Issa looked at the power being offered, felt its seductive pull. She could see the dying lands restored, could envision a world where no woman would ever again be deemed worthless for failing to fit narrow definitions of value. But then she looked at Caspian, saw the raw desperation in his golden eyes, and understood the truth that the Awoken couldn't comprehend. Power without love was just another form of emptiness. She had spent her entire life being told she was inadequate, and now she was being offered everything, but at the cost of the one thing that had ever made her feel truly whole. "I choose love," she said quietly, reaching for Caspian's hand across the fractured space. "Then you choose to die," the Awoken replied sadly. For love alone cannot sustain a Lunweaver. The power will consume you from within if you do not fully embrace it. But as Issa's fingers intertwined with Caspian's, something unexpected happened. His love, his absolute devotion, flowed into her like liquid fire, and she realized with stunning clarity that the awoken were wrong. Love wasn't the opposite of power. Love was power, the greatest force in any universe. "No," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that rivaled the awoken themselves. "I choose both. I choose to be powerful enough to love completely, and to love deeply enough to wield power responsibly." The dimensional space exploded with silver light as Issa's true awakening began, the power of the Lunweavers flowing through her in torrents that remade her from the cellular level up. But instead of consuming her, Caspian's love provided an anchor, a focal point that kept her grounded in her essential humanity, even as godlike power coursed through her veins. Chapter 7. The Crown of Silver Light. The explosion of silver light that marked Issa's awakening shattered the dimensional barriers completely, hurling both her and Caspian back into the physical realm with devastating force. They materialized in the castle's deepest dungeon, where her captors had been preparing the ritual chamber, their bodies slamming into cold stone with bone-jarring impact. Issa gasped as consciousness returned, her newly awakened senses overwhelmed by the sudden shift from the ethereal threshold to harsh reality. Every nerve ending sang with power she was still learning to control, while her vision seemed to pierce through shadows that would have been impenetrable moments before. The dank air of the dungeon carried information now. The scent of fear from the guards who had fled, the metallic tang of blood, and underneath it all, the familiar pine and leather fragrance that belonged uniquely to Caspian. "Issa." His voice reached her through the chaos, rough with exhaustion and relief. She turned to find him struggling to his feet, his royal attire torn and blood-stained from whatever battles he'd fought to reach her. But his golden eyes blazed with an intensity that spoke of love transcendent, the kind of devotion that could breach dimensional barriers through sheer force of will. "I'm here," she whispered, her own voice carrying new harmonics that made the stone walls resonate with sympathetic vibrations. "I'm real." Before either could say more, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the dungeon corridors. Heavy boots on stone, the clink of weapons, and voices raised in military coordination. Lord Edmund's voice cut through the noise, sharp with authority and barely controlled panic. "Seal all exits. The king has been compromised by the witch's influence. Subdue them both if necessary, but the ritual must proceed," Caspian snarled, his wolf rising to the surface as his eyes blazed golden fire. "Edmunds orchestrated this entire conspiracy, the council documents, my supposed orders for your sacrifice, all fabricated to justify what they planned from the beginning. They wanted a Lunweaver for their ritual," Issa said, understanding flooding through her as her awakened consciousness processed the truth. Not just any sacrifice, but one of the old bloodline. They knew what I was before I did, and they used my feelings for you as a weapon. Caspian's voice carried the growl of his wolf as his body began the familiar shift toward his more dangerous form. "Made me complicit in your capture through manufactured evidence." The first wave of guards rounded the corner, their weapons drawn and expressions grim with purpose. But they stopped short when they saw what awaited them. Issa standing with silver light cascading from her skin like liquid moonbeams, while beside her, Caspian completed his transformation into something that was part man, part apex predator. His wolf form was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with midnight dark fur that seemed to absorb light and golden eyes that promised death to anyone who threatened his mate. The Alpha King's power rolled off him in waves that made the lesser wolves among the guards whimper and back away involuntarily. "Stay back," Issa commanded, her voice now carrying the authority of awakened Lunweaver gifts. The guards found themselves frozen, unable to advance against the combined force of her will and Caspian's predatory presence. But Lord Edmund himself appeared behind them, flanked by Councillor Matthias and several other conspirators. In Edmund's hands was an artifact that made Issa's new senses recoil. A twisted staff of black metal inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Fascinating, Edmund said, his voice filled with scholarly fascination rather than fear. The awakening has proceeded exactly as the old text described. You burn with the silver fire of true Lun weavers, girl. Your power will be most effective in restoring the kingdom's fertility. The only thing being restored today, Caspian growled, his wolf's voice harmonizing with human speech, is the natural order you've sought to pervert. Edmund raised the artifact, and immediately Issa felt her connection to the awakened power begin to waver. The staff was some kind of binding device, designed specifically to constrain Lunweaver abilities, but her awakening had been anchored by love rather than pure power, and that made all the difference. Instead of fighting the binding directly, Issa reached out through the soul-deep connection she shared with Caspian. His wolf's strength flowed into her, while her Lunweaver gifts enhanced his already formidable abilities. Together, they became something unprecedented. A mated pair whose individual powers amplified rather than competing with each other. Impossible, Matthias breathed, his scholarly mind recognizing what he was witnessing. The old texts never mentioned such synthesis. Issa raised her hand, and silver light poured forth, not the destructive force Edmund had expected, but something far more profound. The light touched the twisted metal of his artifact and began to unweave its very essence, revealing the corruption at its core and purifying it back to base elements. The staff crumbled to dust in Edmund's hands, taking with it the last of his ability to control the situation. But instead of despair, his face twisted with fanatical determination. "If I cannot bind you," he snarled, "then I'll ensure you die before your power can upset the natural order." He pulled a ceremonial dagger from his robes, a blade that gleamed with the same malevolent energy as the destroyed staff. But before he could strike, Caspian was moving with inhuman speed. His wolf form flowed like liquid shadow, crossing the space between them in a heartbeat. The impact when Caspian's claws met Edmund's chest was both final and absolute. The conspirator's body crumpled, his schemes dying with him, while the cursed dagger clattered harmlessly across the stone floor. "The rest of you," Caspian's voice carried absolute authority as he addressed the remaining conspirators, "will explain exactly how deep this treachery runs, and you will do so before my patience expires entirely." What followed was a systematic dismantling of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed them both. Matthias, faced with his king's supernatural fury and the undeniable evidence of Issa's awakened power, revealed everything. The faked documents, the deliberate manipulation of events to ensure Issa's capture, even the coordination with certain noble houses who had grown tired of Caspian's independent rule. "They promised me knowledge," the old counselor whispered, his scholarly pride finally broken. "Access to the forbidden texts, the secrets of the old bloodlines. I never intended for it to go this far." "Intentions," Caspian said coldly, "matter less than actions, and your actions nearly cost me everything that matters." But it was Issa who stepped forward, her hand touching Caspian's transformed arm in a gesture of restraint. "Enough death," she said quietly. "Let them live with the knowledge of what they've done. Some punishments are more effective than execution." The silver light that emanated from her touch seemed to calm the rage burning in Caspian's wolf, and slowly he began to shift back toward human form. The process was mesmerizing. Fur receding to reveal pale skin, claws shortening to elegant fingers, the massive frame condensing back to merely impressive rather than supernatural proportions. When the transformation was complete, he stood before her fully human, but somehow more than he had been before. The awakening of her gifts had changed him as well, their soul bond deepening his connection to the primal forces that govern their world. "The kingdom needs to know," Issa said, her voice carrying quiet certainty. "Not the details of the conspiracy, but the truth about what we've become. The people deserve to understand that their rulers are bound not just by duty, but by love." Caspian's expression softened as he cupped her face in his hands, his thumb tracing the high arch of her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "Are you certain? Once we announce our bond publicly, there will be no hiding from what you are. The political implications alone." "Let them come," Issa replied, covering his hands with her own. "I've spent my entire life being told I was worthless, because I couldn't fit their narrow definitions of value. I won't hide who I truly am anymore. What followed was a ceremony unlike any in the kingdom's history. Word spread through the castle with supernatural speed. The Alpha King would take a mate, but not in the traditional manner. This would be a true claiming, a ritual that bound souls as well as bodies, witnessed by both mortal nobility and the ethereal awoken who had tested Isa's worthiness. The great hall was transformed once again, but this time the decorations spoke of silver and moonlight rather than earthly harvest. Garlands of night-blooming flowers released their intoxicating fragrance into the air, while crystalline formations that seemed to grow from the stone itself caught and reflected every candle's flame. Isa wore a gown that appeared to be woven from moonbeams themselves, a gift from the awoken, who had acknowledged her as their equal. The fabric moved like liquid light, shifting between silver and pearl and the deep blue of midnight skies. Her blonde hair had been crowned with a circlet of silver leaves that seemed to whisper with their own inner voices. Caspian stood waiting at the altar wearing his formal regalia, but the heavy crown had been replaced by a simpler circlet that matched her own. His expression as she approached down the aisle was one of wonder mixed with fierce possessiveness, the look of a man who had fought across dimensions to claim his mate. The ceremony itself was conducted by the eldest of the awoken, their ethereal forms visible to all present as witnesses to this unprecedented union. When they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that resonated through stone and flesh alike. By the old laws and the new, by the power of moon and wolf, by the bonds that transcend mortality itself, do you, Caspian Ironhold, Alpha King of this realm, claim this woman as your mate, your equal, your other half in all things? I do so claim her, Caspian replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. In this life and whatever lies beyond. And do you, Isadora of the awakened blood, last daughter of the Lunweaver line, accept this claiming? Do you bind your power to his strength, your wisdom to his authority, your heart to his for all eternity? I do, Isa whispered, but her words carried through the vast hall with supernatural clarity. I accept and return his claim, binding myself willingly and completely. What happened next defied the expectations of everyone present. Instead of the traditional exchange of marks that would seal a shifter mating, silver light poured from Isa's hands to envelop them both. The light sank into their skin, leaving behind matching marks that seemed to shift and change, even as they watched, sometimes appearing as Celtic knotwork, sometimes as intertwined wolves and crescent moons. Always beautiful and always undeniably magical. It is done, the awoken pronounced. Let none challenge what has been joined by powers older than kingdoms, stronger than death, truer than time itself. The celebration that followed lasted until dawn, but Isa and Caspian slipped away before the revelries reached their peak. They had eternity to share with others. Tonight belonged to them alone. Chapter 8. The Crown's True Legacy. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and the transformation of the kingdom was nothing short of miraculous. Isa stood at the great window of the royal chambers, watching the morning sun illuminate fields that stretched green and fertile to the horizon. Where once barren soil had cracked under relentless drought, now crops swayed in abundance, their golden heads heavy with grain that would feed the kingdom through the coming winter. The healing had begun the morning after their claiming ceremony, when Isa had walked barefoot through the castle's gardens and felt the earth's pain like a physical wound. The corruption that had been slowly draining life from the soil wasn't natural disease, but the lingering effect of dark magic, the same malevolent force that had powered Edmund's artifact. With her awakened Lunweaver abilities, she had been able to trace the infection to its source and purge it with silver fire, restoring the natural balance that had been disrupted for so long. The morning reports, Your Majesty. Captain Marcus entered with his usual military precision, though his manner toward her had evolved from suspicious hostility to grudging respect. The grizzled soldier had witnessed firsthand the changes her presence had brought to the kingdom, and even his skeptical nature couldn't deny the evidence. Thank you, Captain. Isa accepted the leather portfolio, noting the way he now addressed her with genuine deference rather than mere protocol. Any word from the eastern provinces? Lord Harrison reports the final harvest yields are 40% above normal, Your Majesty. The new irrigation systems you designed are working perfectly, and the soil restoration appears to be permanent. Marcus paused, his scarred features showing something that might have been amazement. There's also news from beyond our borders. 3 neighboring kingdoms have sent envoys requesting audiences about policy changes. Issa smiled, understanding the euphemism. Word of Valdris's transformation had spread far beyond their borders, carried by merchants, diplomats, and refugees who had witnessed the impossible. A kingdom ruled jointly by an alpha king and a Lunweaver queen, where worth was measured by character rather than supernatural ability, where the wolfless could rise to positions of honor and authority. Schedule the audiences for next week, she decided, and ensure our guests see the new academies during their stay. Let them witness what becomes possible when we stop wasting half our population's potential. The academies had been her proudest achievement. Schools where wolfless children learned alongside their shifting peers, where young people discovered that intelligence, creativity, and compassion were gifts as valuable as supernatural strength. The first graduating class had already begun taking positions throughout the kingdom's administration, their fresh perspectives breathing new life into centuries-old traditions. Caspian's voice carried from the adjoining chamber, the deep rumble immediately recognizable even when muffled by stone walls. He was conducting his own morning briefings, coordinating with military commanders about infrastructure projects that would connect remote villages to the kingdom's growing prosperity. The man who had once ruled through strength alone now governed with wisdom, his natural authority enhanced rather than diminished by sharing power with his queen. "There's one more thing, Your Majesty," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more personal. "A messenger arrived from the orphanage. Sister Margaret says they have developments we should know about." Issa's heart quickened at the words. 3 months ago, she and Caspian had begun visiting the royal orphanage regularly, drawn by a shared desire to give back to those society had forgotten. It was during one of those visits that they had met Thomas, a 6-month-old baby whose parents had died during the worst of the famine, leaving him completely alone in the world. The child possessed no shifter blood, no magical abilities, nothing that would make him valuable by the kingdom's old standards. He was simply a human baby who needed love, and from the moment Issa had held him, she had known he was meant to be theirs. "Prepare the carriage," she told Marcus. "I'll collect His Majesty, and we'll leave immediately." 20 minutes later, they were traveling through the capital's bustling streets in the royal carriage, Caspian's hand warm in hers as they watched their transformed kingdom pass by the windows. The changes weren't just agricultural. The people themselves seemed different. Wolfless citizens walked with their heads held high. Their children played freely with shifter youngsters, and the rigid caste system that had defined society for generations was slowly dissolving into something more fluid and humane. "You're nervous," Caspian observed, his enhanced senses picking up the subtle changes in her scent and heartbeat that betrayed her emotional state. "Terrified," Issa admitted. "What if something's wrong? What if he's sick or, Caspian interrupted gently. "Sister Margaret has wonderful news to share and wants to deliver it in person." His golden eyes were warm with affection as he lifted their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. "Either way, we face it together." The orphanage occupied a sprawling complex that had once housed only the most desperate cases, children whose lack of valuable bloodlines marked them for lives of servitude. Now, it functioned more like a proper school, with bright classrooms, well-stocked libraries, and gardens where children could play without fear of judgment. Sister Margaret met them in the main hall, her weathered face glowing with barely contained excitement. The elderly nun had run the orphanage for 3 decades, caring for society's unwanted with fierce devotion and limited resources. The changes of recent months had transformed her from a woman fighting a losing battle against poverty and prejudice into someone who could finally offer real hope to her charges. "Your Majesties," she said, executing a respectful curtsy. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I have the most wonderful news to share." She led them through corridors lined with children's artwork. Colorful drawings that depicted a world where wolves and humans lived in harmony, where queens had silver light in their hands, and kings were gentle giants who protected everyone regardless of their abilities. They found Thomas in the nursery, sitting in a patch of morning sunlight while playing with wooden blocks carved by the older children. At 9 months old, he was a sturdy baby with dark hair and bright blue eyes that lit up the moment he saw them. His arms reached out immediately, and Issa's heart melted as she scooped him up. "The paperwork is complete," Sister Margaret announced, her voice thick with emotion. "The formal adoption has been approved by the council. Thomas is officially your son." The words hit Issa like a physical blow, not of pain, but of overwhelming joy. After a lifetime of being told she was broken, incomplete, worthless, because she couldn't bear children, she was finally a mother, not through biology, but through choice and love, and the deliberate decision to create family from affection rather than bloodline. "Our son," Caspian corrected gently, his large hands careful as he stroked the baby's dark hair. Thomas gurgled happily, completely unaware that he had just become heir to a kingdom, that his ordinary human blood would one day wear a crown that had been reserved for supernatural nobility for centuries. "He'll never shift," Issa said quietly, her voice carrying wonder rather than sadness. "He'll never have magical powers or enhanced senses. He'll just be human. He'll be loved," Caspian replied firmly. "He'll be raised to value compassion over conquest, wisdom over strength. He'll grow up knowing that his worth comes from his character, not his abilities." Sister Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the new family together. "There's something else, Your Majesties. 7 other kingdoms have sent inquiries about our adoption policies. They want to know how to establish similar programs, how to care for children regardless of their bloodlines." As if summoned by their conversation, a group of older children appeared in the nursery doorway. Wolfless youngsters who had once been resigned to lives of servitude, now bright with the knowledge that they could aspire to anything. Among them was Sarah, a 12-year-old girl whose intelligence had been ignored until Issa's educational reforms recognized her potential. "Your Majesty," Sarah said shyly, approaching with a carefully wrapped bundle in her hands. "We made something for Prince Thomas." She unwrapped a beautiful quilt, each square sewn by different children, depicting scenes of the kingdom's transformation. There were images of abundant harvests, children of all backgrounds playing together, and at the center, a royal family that included a perfectly ordinary baby, surrounded by supernatural parents who loved him completely. "It's beautiful," Issa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thomas will treasure it always." But it was what happened next that would live in kingdom legend for generations to come. As Issa held the baby wrapped in his new quilt, silver light began to emanate gently from her hands. Not the fierce power of battle or healing, but something soft and warm that spoke of protection and unconditional love. The light didn't change Thomas, didn't grant him abilities he wasn't born with. Instead, it settled around him like a blessing, a magical ward that would shield him from harm while allowing him to remain perfectly, wonderfully human. "He'll be safe," Caspian observed, his enhanced senses reading the nature of the magical protection. "The silver light will guard him without changing who he is." "As it should be," Issa replied, pressing a gentle kiss to Thomas's forehead. "He's perfect exactly as he is." The afternoon found them back at the castle, but instead of retreating to the royal apartments, they made their way to the new academy where Issa held her weekly classes for wolfless young people. The great hall had been converted into a classroom where 30 students ranging from age 12 to 20 gathered to learn about their own potential. Today's lesson was particularly meaningful. With Thomas sleeping contentedly in Caspian's arms nearby, Issa stood before the assembled students and spoke about the true nature of power. "For too long, this kingdom defined worth by supernatural ability," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "But power comes in many forms. The farmer who feeds a village, the healer who tends the sick, the teacher who opens minds, the parent who loves unconditionally. These are all forms of strength that build kingdoms." A young man in the front row raised his hand. "But Your Majesty, without shifting ability or magic, how can we truly matter? How can we make a difference?" Issa smiled, gesturing to the transformed hall around them, to the thriving kingdom visible through the tall windows, to the sleeping baby in the Alpha King's protective embrace. "Look around you, Marcus. Look at what we've built together. Wolfless and shifter, magical and mundane, all working toward the same goal. The greatest power any of us possess is the ability to choose love over fear, acceptance over prejudice, hope over despair. She moved among the students as she spoke, her silver light creating gentle illuminations that revealed not supernatural gifts, but the unique talents each person carried: artistic ability, mathematical brilliance, natural leadership, the capacity for deep empathy. "You are not broken," she continued, the words echoing her own journey from shame to self-acceptance. "You are not lesser. You are exactly what this kingdom needs. People who understand that true strength comes from perseverance, that real nobility comes from service, that the greatest magic of all is the ability to see worth in others that they cannot see in themselves." The session concluded with a demonstration that had become her signature, teaching the students to perceive the silver threads that connected all living things, the invisible network of care and compassion that held communities together. Not everyone could see them clearly, but all could feel their presence, could understand their role in the greater tapestry of existence. As the sun set over Valdris, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the royal family returned to their chambers. Thomas had awakened and was babbling happily as Caspian carried him, the baby's ordinary human sounds somehow more precious than any supernatural display. "He'll be a good king," Issa said quietly, as they watched Caspian settle into a chair by the fireplace, the intimidating alpha king transformed into a gentle father making silly faces to earn baby giggles. "He'll be better than good," Caspian replied, looking up with eyes that glowed, not with wolf fire, but with paternal love. "He'll be kind." In a world that spent too long valuing strength over compassion, kindness might be the most revolutionary trait of all. Later that evening, as Thomas slept peacefully in his new nursery, Issa and Caspian stood together on their balcony, overlooking the kingdom they had transformed. The lights of the capital sparkled like earthbound stars, while in the distance, the fertile fields stretched endlessly under the silver moon. "Any regrets?" Caspian asked, his arm around her waist as they surveyed their domain. Issa considered the question seriously. A year ago, she had been a worthless peasant girl, sold by her father and resigned to a life of servitude. Now she was queen of a thriving kingdom, mother to a child who would grow up knowing he was valued for exactly who he was, teacher to a generation that would reshape the world through acceptance rather than division. "None," she said finally, leaning into his warmth. "Every moment of pain led us here. Every rejection, every humiliation, every night I cried myself to sleep believing I was broken. It all had purpose, and our son will never know that pain," Caspian added softly. "He'll grow up in a world where worth isn't determined by what you can do, but by who you choose to be." In the distance, a wolf howled, not in grief or rage as Caspian's wolf had once done, but in pure joy. The sound was answered by others across the kingdom, a symphony of voices celebrating not conquest or dominance, but the simple miracle of a realm where everyone belonged. And in the nursery behind them, Prince Thomas of Valdris slept peacefully under his handmade quilt, dreaming ordinary human dreams in a kingdom that had finally learned to treasure the extraordinary power of love. But Issa and Caspian's journey is merely the first chapter. Throughout mystical realms, endless hearts endure abandonment, those branded as broken simply for being different, souls cast out for failing to meet impossible standards. Their stories of healing and acceptance await discovery. By not subscribing, you're leaving these voices unheard, these journeys untold. You're walking away from this ending without helping others find hope. True family never abandons those still searching for their place. Ready to join us? Share your thoughts below. Thank you for journeying with us tonight. If this tale moved you, we have countless others waiting. Forbidden romances, supernatural bonds, second chances that change everything. Hit subscribe and the bell to never miss our next adventure. We're honored to have you in our storytelling family. Until we meet again in the next tale,